Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or good day, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the next episode of No Dice, No Glory. Sponsored by our jobs that actually pay us money, we're coming to you not at all live from an abandoned arms factory deep under a mountain in West Virginia. We are proud to proffer to you the finest in wargaming coverage. Without any further ado, let's get this show on the road.
Well, thank you very much, Sean, for the introduction. And thank you very much for listening to this No Dice, No Glory podcast, a first in the series in collaboration with Casemate Publishing, where we're going to talk to some of their authors that we think our audience and, of course, Casemate's audience would really like to hear from. And first up, all the way from Australia, where it's very early in the morning, is Tom Lewis. Welcome, Thomas. Or
Good morning.
You go by Tom or Thomas?
Either. Tom was best.
Tom is best. So we're going to talk today about his book, Atomic Salvation, How the Atomic Bomb Attack Saved the Lives of 32 million people. I've read the book, and we're going to talk about it in some depth. But Tom, let's first hear about you and your background.
Sure. Well, I've got a sort of curious background in that I started off as a teacher of English and drama and history and information technology back in the 80s. And I was a dive master on the Great Barrier Reef, wonderful place, and a bit of a traveller, I suppose, always interested in going overseas. And gradually started changing over from the occasional newspaper article I've been writing. I got through university by being a bit of a researcher for our ABC, which is the government-sponsored radio, TV channel here. And I'd penned articles for newspapers and ended up as an English teacher, English history, as I said, by tea and so on. One day I accepted a job in Darwin. I've been teaching in Tasmania, which is a little island down the bottom where the Tasmanian devil comes from, and in Queensland. And then I accepted a job in the Northern Territory, and my girlfriend and I travelled up here. And I was curious about the shipwrecks in the harbour, and I started diving them, doing a bit of dive master work part-time. And nobody seemed to know too much about them. The Territory had been devastated by war in World War II, and those wrecks had come from that. There were some Catalinas, fighter aircraft reputed to be around, certainly freighters, and a local destroyer, the USS Peary, which had gone down fighting. And then there had been a big cyclone called Cyclone Tracy in 1974, which had wiped the place out again, and there were more wrecks from that. And I started diving on them, and eventually the newspaper articles, which I'd sold to the local paper, got turned into a book. A publisher phoned me up one day, and if I remember rightly, he said, how would you like not to be tomorrow's fish and chip wrapper? So in other words, we'll put your articles into a book and they'll be there permanently. And that was my first book. So I went on from there. But obviously I had a bit of a connection with the sea. I had learnt to sail in my young days. And I also got asked by the local Navy Reserve if I'd like to join the Navy as an officer in intelligence. And I was teaching at the local high school, and I thought this would be sort of interesting work and different from teaching. And off I went. And eventually I went full-time with them, and there were more books that I produced. We've got a big submarine outside the harbour here, 80-man Japanese submarine with the Japanese still inside it. And that was a great wreck, and I wasn't allowed to dive it. It was off limits as a war grave. And so one thing led to the other. I turned out a book about the submarine. I turned out a book about the first big air raid, which had devastated Darwin in 1942. Incidentally, more Americans died in that raid than Australians. So 128 out of 235 who died were US citizens or in US service, curiously. So what are they doing over here, I wondered. And I eventually went full-time with the forces, served in a couple of conflicts, more intelligence work, more books, and eventually full-time military history, and then back to a bit of teaching, which I'm doing now. So I need to slow down a bit, I think. And this book is one of many. I think it's about number 14 or 15 that I've either co-authored or authored myself.
So a lot of folks that have been listening to our podcast think that you're not real, that you're my dream interview because you cover all the bases of stuff I like to talk about. But
Right.
I can assure you, I can't do an Australian accent quite that good. So, Atomic Salvation, an interesting premise for a book. I know we discussed, in the pre-interview a little bit, but what was the motivation behind writing that book?
Well, I suppose I got a bit irritated every August when there was a sort of annual pile-on, to use that modern term, or a good kicking given to the people who had devastated Japan with 2 atomic bombs. And you saw these articles appearing that, even used the word terrorism, which I found highly objectionable, being an anti-terrorism intelligence analyst myself, which was one of my streams of work that I was doing full time. And I thought this was wrong. And I thought, surely from a military perspective, you can see that this was a good idea. And then you sort of recoil from that and you say, oh, you can't use the word good idea with atomic weapons that killed nearly 200,000 people. So I suppose, as authors do, I started collecting material against the day that I might one day put this into some sort of coherent form. I turned out a book in 2013 called Lethality in Combat, which was, again, another one of those things I like to do in my sort of area of history, is to look at something and think, well, no, that's wrong. They've got things the wrong way around, and you turn it on its head. Lethality in Combat was about the actuality of battlefield behaviour, how people really behave on the battlefield, as opposed to the movies or what you wrote in your letter to mum. And I argued that there were sort of 3 streams there, that sometimes warriors have to be, I call it enthusiastic, again, it's the wrong term. Also, you get civilians quite often targeted when people say, oh, you shouldn't. We're going through that in the papers here about some of our commandos being targeted for doing the wrong thing in Afghanistan, by the way. And there was a 3rd section about quite often prisoners aren't taken when you say, oh, they should be. And then, having seen combat myself, I put that book together, came out in 2013. Lethality in Combat instantly earned me lots of criticism. But one of the best letters I ever got, I think, as an author was a bloke wrote to me. Bloke is the Australian equivalent of guy. And he said, the book's being passed from hand to hand in the officer training school down in the army, down in Canberra. And he said, most of us can't afford to buy our own copy. So we've got a few that are getting a bit dog-eared. And he said, because it's telling it like it really is, as opposed to some of the stuff they give us. And I thought, geez, thanks a lot. I won't publish your name, you'll get into trouble. So long-winded explanation there, but Atomic Salvation's the same sort of thing. From a military point of view, the atomic bombs make so much sense. And over time, I sort of saw that, okay, this argument's got some coherence. People sort of say, oh, okay, well, maybe there's a point there. But in the end, I sort of saw that there were no numbers really given to that argument. Okay, if it saved Allied lives, and by Allied, most of them would have been USA people, soldiers and sailors and airmen, we would have gone in, the Australians, New Zealanders, the Brits, the Canadians, whatever, but the bulk of the invasion force would have been you guys, the Americans. And it was, okay, well, how many lives would have been lost? Let's quantify that for once. And so I started doing the maths. In the back of the book, chapters 17 and 18, I think it is, have the numbers for how many people would have died in a conventional invasion. And not only, of course, was it from our side, it's the Japanese side. Now, I've been to Japan many times researching. I love the place. I like the Japanese. It's a terrific country. But boy, are they weird in World War II. And nobody dies like the Japanese in World War II. And I was looking at things called, for example, the Saipan ratio, which was the invasion of Saipan. How many Japanese died in their armed force in that desperate attempt to hold Saipan against US forces? 97% is the average of the people who died in their armed forces in the invasion of the islands as MacArthur and other people, Nimitz and so on, made their way across the Pacific. So you add it up, 97% of the Japanese forces on those islands died. Now, in military parlance, if you examine a war like I teach a bit of wargaming, I teach that to my year 11 and 12 students. We study the American Civil War. So if you look at a war like that, or if you like a battle in Vietnam, Drang, for example, or you go back to look at, say, the English Civil War battles, you find, in general, in Napoleon's time and so on, 30% of an army, when they're lying on the ground, dead or wounded, they break. They break and run. Everybody does that. So you look at the bloke beside you on the ground, and he's sort of bleeding, and then you get shot and you're sort of bleeding, and there's another bloke dead. And the other 7 standing up go, well, we're not doing this anymore. It's a bad idea. Let's run away. So they run away. They break. Their morale goes. And that holds true if you examine military history for pretty well all wars and battles, except for the Japanese in World War II. They don't break and run. These guys die. And it's not wounded either. They die. So I added up how many people have the Japanese got fighting in World War II in 1945. The answer is about 6 million. Okay, do the math. 97% of 6 million. That's the number of Japanese who would have died from their armed forces. And then you go on to their militia. And then you go on to the people who are dying as a result of being occupied by the Japanese. Every day people are dying. Sweeney, who was one of the B-29 bombers, he actually put a figure on it at one stage. And he was saying that it was 970, I think it was, a week of your guys who are dying. Every week that goes on. And so this grim total marches its way towards the end of 1946. That's what would have happened if the A-bombs hadn't been used. 30 million people would have died.
So you mentioned Sweeney a lot in the book, and maybe I should boast, but I can't find it. I have a picture signed by the navigator on Enola Gay.
Right. Okay.
What's it? Van Kirk, Dutch.
Yes.
I keep forgetting his name because I got to meet him. So let me ask one question starting off. Since the A-bomb, the atomic bomb, was primarily a secret from MacArthur and Nimitz and Slim as they executed the war, would their strategy have changed in prosecuting the war had they known about this weapon earlier?
I don't think so, because nobody really knew whether it was going to work in combat. So the Manhattan experiment had shown with the Trinity test bomb that the thing goes bang. There were 2 different types used in the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they're sort of reasonably sure that one type would work and the other type wouldn't. The other thing, though, is you'd never dropped it from the B-29.
Correct.
And it might be the B-29 has such a massive problem on the way there that it ends up in the sea. I mean, you're taking off from Tinian, under Tinian. And you might not get there because the Japanese might just manage to shoot you down. I mean, most of the time they couldn't do that to the B-29s then. But if you look at the record of air combat operations in World War II, for every plane lost in combat, you lost 6 in training or test flights or accidents, or somebody forgot to do this. And they're much less reliable than they are now. I mean, that's a shocking statistic. It was Hildebrand, I think, who's the famous, was he runner? And he got shot down and imprisoned.
Zamperetti.
That's it, yeah. Hildebrand was the author. It's sort of one of those shocking statistics from World War II. You don't believe that. And then you start investigating and you go, wow, these guys, they just die in training like you wouldn't believe. Yeah. So I can see why they kept it secret. But the thing is, in 1945, and if you read, and this, I've relied very heavily on the account of Marines with the Old Breed, for example, the book. And I looked at first-hand accounts of diaries. And as people fought their way across the Pacific, I've actually got a chapter on veterans' reactions to the A-bomb. And
you mentioned Sledge quite a bit.
Yeah. These guys were all so relieved when the A-bombs went off because they knew, and they learnt the hard way, that what was coming up was D-Day Mark II. And D-Day had been bad enough in 1944, 6th of June, in France. The Americans they take two beaches. Omaha, of course, is the most famous, from Saving Private Ryan and so on. And I've walked those cliffs, and wow, thank you, no. We actually have a marine base here, about 10 kilometres from where I'm talking at the moment. And you guys did such a wonderful job in World War II. I mean, ultimate respect for your Marines. But Normandy, there were 2 US beaches, 2 Brits and 1 Canadian. And the death toll over the next 10 weeks was enormous. I think it was 76,000. I've got it in the book. So you're talking enormous casualties as everybody storms ashore down the left-hand end of Japan. And then over time, having consolidated that end and using it as an air base, because an attack on Tokyo itself would have been impossible. The defence was so heavy. So you consolidate and start using Kyushu Peninsula as an air base, and off you go over 1946. And don't forget, the winter can be pretty severe there, and that's going to always slow you down. And then over the next year, you fight your way northeast, and then finally there's another landing in Tokyo Bay, and you join hands and off you go. By this time, at the end of 1946, that's where that 1 million+ Allied deaths come from, and the Japanese die in their millions. And for anybody who hasn't been to Japan, one great statistic is 75% of Japan is not level. It's hills and mountains. It's a really hilly place. And I've got some accounts in the book of some of your guys who were there from occupation forces and so on, including a Navy bloke who sailed through the inner seas, as they call them. And he was just aghast. We would have been fighting our way through this. It's just not tank country. It's not even aircraft country. It's hills, valleys, tunnels. If you go to Okinawa, you see 62 miles of tunnels that the Japanese hollowed out and used as their defences. And they fought for every yard. And you couldn't leave the Japanese down one end of Okinawa in their tunnels and sort of, we'll just leave them there for the rest of the war. No, they'd have been out every night, and they'd have been mounting raids on the aircraft that we were trying to now use to attack Japan, because aircraft are sort of part of the key to success, as is the US submarine fleet, which was doing a great job of starving out Japan. So that would have been plodding towards Tokyo without the A-bombs. So they were a great salvation. I don't think it would have been a great deal different if somebody had told Nimitz and Slim and MacArthur and so on, we've got these great secret weapons, and said, oh, great, terrific, when can we use one? Well, we're sort of test piloting it now, and you never know. Well, we'll just keep going.
If they would have read the reports when the 509th was at Wendover Air Force Base in Utah, of how hard that mission profile was, they probably would have thought much differently. So looking at the book, you go about, the main premise, what I got from reading it is, and let me just clarify one thing to our listeners that we talked about last time, that the backlash for U.S. using the bomb is not, in my opinion, a very big story here. When it's taught in school, a lot of times it's an ethics debate question, and even going through, my background, retired Air Force, that work with nukes, that we kind of use it as an ethical question. But I think the end use is really not one that's controversial here. I do know elsewhere in the world, and you state that in one of the later chapters, that there's, when you talk about the children's books, that they don't mention Pearl Harbor, they don't mention a lot of things. And I mean, even, one of my favorite authors, Robin Nellens, he has a bias. So, so not, and now I wouldn't say it's a very big deal here, but not as controversial. But going through the book, and for the readers out there, listeners out there who've not read the book, you go chapter by chapter, building your case throughout the book. What I like about every chapter is you kind of have your thesis, and at the end you wrap it up. So I could tell definitely from reading it before we even talked about it that you're somebody that delves a lot in academia. Looking at some of the primary sources that you use, and I know you use Frank. That was a great book. the Operation Olympic book. I think Dos Santos. I don't remember the guy's name, and even reading Retribution. I think that's Hastings that came out. You know, the rationale for using the bomb during the war, it always falls under a few categories which you spell out. One is the saving of lives. That's normally put in Allied lives. What I noticed differently about your book is you really put it in Japanese lives. My question would be, would there be a point after U.S. and Allied forces landed where the Japanese would have capitulated before total surrender? Because you bring up the 97, 98%. I think one of the battles that had the most survivors was Saipan that you cite. Would the Japanese have probably said, look, they're here, we're starving, maybe this is not worth fighting? I'm curious to see what you think of that statement.
I don't. I've tried to know the Japanese ever since I went there in '93 to study the submarine outside the harbour here. I'm a member of the Australian Japanese Association, as I'm a member of the Australian American Association. So you go to another country and you try and understand the way their minds think. I mean, that's half the thing of being an intelligence analyst. And it's fatal, of course, to think everybody thinks like us. No, they don't.
Oh, it's very fatal.
Yeah. I mean, the Indonesians to our north here, they don't think like Australians. They look at the world in a different way. The Brits look at the world in a different way. The Japanese just don't think like us. They think we're crazy. And maybe they're right. But you go there now and you see flashing vending machines on the corner of streets selling whiskey and beer, stockings and stuff. You know, you can have a good time here in Japan. In the middle of the night.
I've been there.
It's got these flashing lights to attract attention. Come and buy stuff out of me. They've got a negative attitude towards crime over there. They don't get much crime. In Australia, somebody would steal that vending machine, I'm ashamed to say. But in Japan, nobody thinks like that. They just don't think the same way. And in World War II, they don't think the same way. The emperor says, do this, you're going to do it. In the accounts that I looked at, and I like to go after diary accounts to get the minds of people, rather than letters, which was read by mum and sort of self-censor a bit. And very few Japanese moaned about things in World War II. They might moan a bit, and nobody sort of really likes their son being a kamikaze guy. I got a few negative reactions from families there. But they were proud at the same time, but they were sorrowful. But nobody turns their face away from the enemy. And there are pictures in the book of 13-year-old Japanese girls in rows being trained to use pikes and muskets from the 19th, 18th century, single shot, smoothbore weapons. You'd be lucky to hit a pig at 50 metres.
Which I think you stayed in the book.
Yeah, they're going to take on tanks with this. They're going to be out there trying to sort of aim at aircraft. And sophistication in terms of armour and artillery and aircraft is what the Allies were good at in 1945. They're going to stand up and use what are called satchel charges. It's an explosive in a satchel, and you put the satchel on your shoulder and you hurl yourself under a tank and you pull the wire and hopefully it goes bang and so does the tank. The tank's not going to go bang. Yeah, the tank's not going to go bang very much in 1945. It's going to go over the top of you and kill you. So the slaughter would have been incredible. But the way these people think is just so weird. We didn't understand the principle of kamikaze much, but it makes a fair bit of sense when you think about it. One plane, one man, one aircraft carrier, hopefully. They were pretty hopeless. They were lucky if they got through to 1%. But at the end of World War II, in mid-1945, they had 10,000 kamikazes ready to go. They had 10,000 suicide speedboats. Now, these are a one-man, and sometimes there was a two-man model in the army. They had explosives in the nose. They're going to come at you at 40 knots. They put them in caves along the coastlines of Japan, and suddenly you're going to get hit by a swarm of these speedboats coming towards you in a picket destroyer, or, unfortunately, a troop ship, a landing ship tank, whatever. These actually are tactics that are used by the Middle East countries. decades later, swarm tactics. Okay, one of them has got to get through, and you might kill 9 out of 10, but if one gets through and he hits the side of your ship, he's going to wreck your day, and you're going to kill a lot of people for one man. Now, not only did they have suicide aircraft and suicide speedboats, they also had suicide submarines, which would do the same thing. And here's a really strange idea: suicide divers. Now, this isn't so much a suicide diver who puts a
I
living
read
on
that.
the side of your ship.
I found that part of the book fascinating.
Yeah, how weird. Actually, I didn't believe it when I read about it, because I thought nobody would be that stupid. I was a dive master of long experience, and I thought nobody can be this stupid. Even in 1945, when you had pretty primitive breathing sets, to do something like this, it's just not going to work. Well, they sort of did make it work. The idea was that this guy was wearing his breathing suit. He is lying on the bottom of the sea. He's down about 20 or 30 feet. And as the Higgins boat comes over the top of him, he's got an explosive on a pole, and he rams it against the bottom of the Higgins boat, or the landing boat, whatever, and he blows it up and he kills himself. It's just not going to work. You would have fired grenade launchers, be a very simple sort of defence, against in front of your Higgins boats. You just saturate the beaches with explosives, as you do anyway, from aircraft and guns and so on, and all of these divers are going to die. It would have been better to put them in as kamikaze pilots, but it takes them longer to train and things like that. So it's just indicative of the way the Japanese face is turned towards the enemy. And you don't turn it away. You don't doubt the emperor. The emperor's got his life in your hands, and you're happy to die for the emperor. And you can look at the history of their forces in the Pacific, and you can see, okay, so if you're in the US Army or the Marines or the Aussies or whatever, you're trained up a bit and you're told don't trust them and things like that. But you're sort of not a really homicidal maniac killer when you start off. This guy's lying in a ditch with only a loincloth on, groaning, and he's covered in blood, and you think, radio, well, we might have him. The intelligence people said, okay, a prisoner's not a bad idea. They did say, watch out. Somebody goes over and starts to pick him up. He's got a grenade in his loincloth, and he blows you up. And when they had their hospitals and the hospital wounded couldn't come along with the forces as they retreated, they would be given a grenade and they would be happy to die. And this isn't some sort of Allied propaganda. This is from their own side. They're saying, this is what we do. We're Japanese. And when the Japanese are told to do something and they do the whole big country stick together really well, that's what they do. And when the Japanese emperor told them, stop fighting, things haven't gone too well, he sort of said in his radio broadcast. Things haven't gone necessarily to our advantage, I think was the phrase. And he said, now we have to stop doing this and we have to cooperate with these incoming people and we have to rebuild our country. And your people were amazed when you're driving in a truck. You're a US Army guy, you're driving in a truck down the road, you've got a few guys on the back. And there's Japanese soldiers in uniform bowing to you from the side of the road. And they're bowing to you because we acknowledge you are the new boss. Our boss told us that you are the new boss, along with him, and we have to do what you say and clear the roads. And where would you like me to start digging? So there's no werewolf operations, as the Germans envisaged, didn't work very well. But if the Japanese emperor had said, okay, we've got lots of caves around the place, and the Nagano complex is ready to go for me, and there's kilometres of that the Japanese royal family was going to retreat to. Let's keep fighting. You would have kept fighting the Japanese for years. As we found, with a few abandoned guys on islands that didn't get the orders. That's the way the Japanese fight.
In our last conversation, you didn't tell me you were a diver. When I was reading the section about the cure room suicide frogman, I kind of knew that you had some diving experience because it's in great detail. One of the things to bring up in the book, and you mentioned propaganda, is I see a paradox in the book that and once again, my opinion, and I'm asking about right or wrong, you have a great respect for the fighting, the martial sense of the Japanese, that they were great warriors.
Oh, true, yeah.
And the other side of that paradox is, call it propaganda, but you touch upon it, but you don't kind of bring it to the front of the book. But you and I know this. There has to be some respect of your enemy. There also has to be a sense of hatred. a sense of moral right. And throughout the book, you go back and forth with that. From doing this book, what would your final assessment be? Would it, I know we can't separate hate from, just like we can't separate fear,
Hmm.
but would you say that more so that the soldier was motivated by hatred, or the fact that they fought our side, the Allies fought so hard, was out of respect for the enemy? You bring up that story about the lieutenant saying, "If anybody says this, I'll shoot you," about the
Yeah.
enemy not being that good. What would your
Yeah.
final assessment there be?
Oh, I agree with what that lieutenant said. They're tremendous fighting troops, and at the same time, you do have a bit of respect for them. There's submariners, for example. There's that submarine outside the harbour here. Um, I was helping build we didn't call it a memorial because it's a bit of a sensitive word over here. The POW thing's a big thing in Australia. But they were fighting Navy people who gave as good as they got, and so did we. It was actually an Australian ship that killed it. It was our first Japanese submarine kill. And it was a near-run thing, as they said about Trafalgar.
Yeah,
They said about Waterloo, didn't they?
Waterloo. Yeah,
But you don't hesitate when the chips are down. You know that, I know that from our combat experience. You fight him and you kill him, and if he looks like he's going to still keep fighting when he's on the ground, you kill him again. And I have no hesitation in saying that. Lethality in Combat, that book, showed that. You don't trust a wounded enemy until you're absolutely sure that he's definitely out of the fight. So in a street fight, you're going through house by house. Give him another one, shoot him twice, another one on the head to be sure. Now that's a terrible
right.
thing to say, isn't it? But
It's
that's what you
it's
do to
reality,
survive in warfare.
right?
Yeah. Only then can you respect him. And look, if he doesn't want to play by those rules, you sort of say, rightio, the Japanese rule in warfare is we don't even give up when we're wounded. We don't even give up when we're prisoners. So you say, right, the Japanese behave differently. And we had a huge breakout of prisoners here. Over 1,000 broke out in a place called Carra in New South Wales in 1944. And one of them was a bloke who'd been shot down in the Zero in Darwin in 1942, and he'd been imprisoned. And he was so ashamed of being imprisoned, he gave a false name, and he was one of the leaders of the breakout. He blew a bugle at midnight for them to get out over the wire. And when they discovered that they couldn't escape, they were so far inland, there was nowhere to go. Australia's a huge place, it's the size of the USA. They just
It's
were in
bigger.
despair. Yeah, well, they were in despair. There's nowhere to go. We can't even get to the coast. So a lot of them laid down on the nearby railroad tracks, and a train decapitated them. This guy, he killed himself with, I think it was a razor blade, in a
Wow.
ditch outside the prisoner of war camp, rather than be recaptured.
Yeah,
So
having
that's how they fight. They're crazy. Crazy brave is the word, maybe. Um,
having been to Alice Springs and for a site visit, you would
yeah.
not think Australia has any beach line whatsoever. And I wouldn't want to walk it because it's long enough to
No.
fly. Um,
Yeah.
do you think? And you once again, you do bring this up in the book, but without a fine point to it. The war against Germany and Japan were prosecuted. I'm going to say pretty much the same, but I think history looks at it as we prosecuted the war against Japan with a little bit more violence. Hence the name of Hastings' book, Retribution. You have Pearl
Mm-hmm.
Harbor. You have the perfidy of the Japanese throughout the war.
Mm-hmm.
The Germans had the SS, who also fought almost to the last man, especially against the Soviets. Um,
Mm.
do you think, or what do you feel about the argument that we fought the war differently with the Japanese because they weren't Western culture?
No, I don't buy it really.
Okay.
The SS, yeah, I know they sort of got a little bit extra because they were a bit fanatical about surrendering and so on. But the look, here's an argument against it. Britain was on rationing after Japan finished rationing in the 1950s. And
Right.
if you want to eradicate your enemy from racial views, then just bomb him into the ground. Nobody would have objected much in 1945, 1946. But in fact, the occupation forces cleared the roads and helped Japan build into the economic superpower it became in the 1960s. One Japanese officer actually said to me, for us, the war was a good thing. And after I picked myself up off the floor and said, millions of your people were dead, what do you mean? He said, well, we were a feudal society before World War II. The Bushido basically kicked back sides wherever they felt like it, and people could kill you and so on. And look at us now. We came out of World War II and we rebuilt the place, and we've got an incredible standard of living.
Right.
I mean, if you want to eradicate Japan, you could have done so. Britain would have joined in. Nobody had much sympathy for the Japanese after the way they behaved with the POWs. And I never resigned from saying that. They behaved badly, disgracefully. But don't forget, of course, and you know it and I know it because we're both ex-military, you prosecute the war to the limit of your extent. One US general said about their time going through Europe, he said, we blasted our way across Europe using high explosive. And if you had a German town that was showing signs of fight after it had been bombarded a bit and attacked from the air and so on, and if there weren't too many white flags out, and if you started seeing snipers appearing and you were being sniped at, you simply pulled back. You pull back your precious soft-skinned infantry, which you safeguard, and you hit it again with your armour and your air power and your artillery. And then you go forward. And only then do you go forward and expose your infantry to fire.
I reread that section. I reread that part last night in the book.
That's what we would have done. We'd have done that in Japan. And no armed force results from that. No armed force in the world, once combat's been joined. And of course, what was the first thing the RAF, the British, dropped on the Germans in World War II? Leaflets. Give up, you guys. Give up. It was a really bad idea. Go back to Berlin. The Germans apparently thought it was very funny. But of course...
Well, they were right.
Yeah, well, it was giving them time and space to get their invasion act together to invade Paris. So by the time warfare's joined and you've got the gloves off, so to speak, and you're really sort of doing it properly and professionally and going forward and doing your job well, that's what would have happened in Japan. So any Japanese place that showed fight, you just pull back, you hit it with air power and artillery if you can reach it, and armour if you can, and don't forget, of course, it's hilly and mountainous and horrible. Only then do you expose your infantry. We would have killed them by the hundreds of thousands. Probably 100,000. I mean, 100,000 a week. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But if you add up the numbers, that's what I did. I did the numbers in the last chapters. They're horrible numbers. You got people dying of starvation. There's a section called on battle rhythm. You can't hold back. You don't stop and say, let's stop for a few weeks, because you can't do that in armed force combat. You train up and you're ready to go, and then you start going forward, and you've got this battle rhythm. Every day, this is what we do in the aircraft carrier. We mount a raid. We mount a CAP, a combat air patrol. Some of our guys get shot down. We rescue them, and then we go forward a bit more, and then we get to the pushback, and then we go forward again, and we just keep going. You can't put the war on hold and then get it out of the bag again in 2 weeks. That's why these people who start arguing about alternatives to sort of, I'll starve them out or wait for the Russians. They're just sort of so disconnected with the reality of combat.
Which is something I do want to bring up. And it was really one of the things in the book that I wouldn't say disagreed with, but I have a different point of view. That one of the reasons or the rationale for dropping the bomb was a demonstration to the Soviets, which you discount. You bring about, you state in the book rather well about how, as far as capes or capabilities for amphibious assault aircraft carriers, even certain types of aircraft, for them to prosecute war against the Japanese home islands. The Russians, it really wasn't a factor to use the bomb to kind of start the Cold War. I've always felt that if I was going to give Truman a plus, that would be one thing I would do to kind of set about starting a Cold War, or at least keeping the Russians from, in September of 1945, yes, there was pretty much quote unquote peace in Europe. But, you had some U.S. generals that said, why don't we just keep on going?
Yep.
You look at even Berlin, the status of East and West Germany in Berlin. Most people thought that happened on May 9th, 1945. It didn't happen until almost a decade later.
Yeah.
I would say that in the grand strategy of the Allies, if you want to stop the Soviets from moving further to the west, a demonstration in another theater of using the atomic, to me, would be something I would say, and would be a reason for doing that. You look at what kept the Russians kind of at bay in Europe for the next decade. I would say the lack of atomic weapons had something to do with it. Now, in prosecuting war against Japan, unless you put their holdings in China and Manchuria as a way to defeat Japan, as a big reason for the Japanese capitulation. You don't use it as a rationale. I think that would be, once again, if I was Truman, repeating my point, I would definitely have done that. I know I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for that. I probably won't. But I think that was something important that the U.S. and the Free Allies almost had to do towards the end of the war because of the imbalance of troops in Europe. I would say that you're 100% correct. Soviets really couldn't have prosecuted war on the home island. But Europe would have been theirs for the taking. I would say the atomic bomb stalled that. And if you look at how the Russians thought, that was something they were scared of. And their espionage service went full speed in trying to develop an atomic weapon to kind of even the balance of power.
Yeah. Well, they do say that Stalin, when he was told about the nuclear weapon, he sort of just nodded and said, "Yeah, okay, we know about that." And they did. Fuchsia's and so on, the espionage efforts, doing a good job. I think it was more like it was a nice to have. So if you're sort of using the atomic war to end the war, and everybody wants a peace dividend, unless they're a mad Soviet who wants to take over the entire world. I hate the Soviet ethos. I had to study Russian literature for 3 years, and
I did that too, by the way.
Did you? Isn't it depressing?
I did.
Yeah.
And
every book's 600 pages long. The first 300 pages, he broods about whether he's going to do something, and then he does it on page 301.
And it never ends well.
The rest of it. Yeah, they're really sad. I like Russian literature, if you can say such a thing, but I don't like what they were doing in terms of the Soviets in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and so on. These guys are homicidal towards their own people, and everybody remembers Hitler. He's the funny guy with the moustache, and 6 million people he sort of had herded into the concentration camps and so on. Well, what about the 30 million that is estimated that died under Stalin? Of his own people. They want to export this. They want to export this to the world, and they're not joking. They're not being silly about it. I mean, I know the domino theory got a bit of a kicking in the Vietnam War, but these guys are genuine. They want to export their idea to the world, and there's lots of them around these days. Wouldn't it be a really good idea if government owned everything and there was no such thing as private enterprise? And you, with your fancy idea over there in the garage, you better get into line because we're going to come for you in the middle of the night. Come on, we are fighting for freedom here. And look, you referred to at the beginning when we started talking about America and the way it's perceived and so on. I have a great deal of respect for America, and I know that sometimes over here, for example, they do get a bit of a kicking in some of the left-wing papers, but only the Americans send massive, huge, great hospital ships around the Philippines doing eye operations and ear operations, and they do them for nothing. And they do thousands of them because the ship's USS Comfort is so big, and Mercy and ships like that. I mean, what other nation does that and exports its good ideas to the world like that? We don't do it. And Australia's a very wealthy nation. We don't have that capability. We don't do that. We should. So doing good actions for peace. It's very easy to criticise American foreign policy in the Cold War, but I think they did a good job. I teach the Cold War to my year 11 and 12 students, and I wouldn't want to live under the Soviet boot. And it's not a joke. It's the boot that you had in 1984, the novel, where O'Brien says to Winston Smith, if you want a vision of the future, imagine a boot coming down on a human face forever.
Right.
So, look, I mean, I get a bit wound up there, but so
no.
The end of the war, you're ending it with atomic weapons. The Soviets see it. That's a nice to have. It might just hold back the forces of evil a bit more. And don't forget, of course, that the forces of evil were held back from taking Japan. The Soviets would have liked to have taken a fair bit of Japan. In fact, in the book, there's a little action where they did an amphibious landing and they got their backside handed to them by the Japanese, who really kicked their backsides. And
how much?
Sorry?
No, how much do you think how Japan prosecuted the war and how the war ended for them feeds today in their current strategic military policy?
I think they're pretty well across where they are geopolitically. If you're in Japan, you're pretty well aware you've got a raving lunatic to your north there in North Korea, and he thinks it's amusing to fire missiles over your country. And so they fall into the sea and they pass over your country. I mean, I don't know how the Japanese have held themselves back over the years. They sort of tend to get a bit testy with people that do things like that. And of course, you've got the fear of China. I was in Japan, in Ishigaki, off Okinawa towards what now is called Taiwan and was called Formosa in World War II. And you're actually very, very close to China there. And they have always had a bad relationship with China. It goes back many hundreds of years, as they have with North Korea.
Yes, they have.
The Koreans are probably better off now with the South Koreans. I don't know how sort of friendly they are there, but they're sort of sensible people. And I sort of see Japan as having no great wish to go large in terms of their armed forces, but they do it because, as a lot of countries do, they go, well, look, it's better to have a guard dog than no guard dog at all. And while we're doing it, let's have 5 and make sure they're big ones. As to whether they'd ever sort of go nuclear aircraft carrier and sort of start getting a bit more aggressive, I don't know. We always sort of go, let's hold back and let's not do it. I'm sort of a bit more of the school of thought that says go big and go large and go frightening and let's not have a war. If that had happened in the 1930s, you might have had 10 million dead rather than 60 million dead in World War II. You give Hitler a good scene to it when he starts getting aggressive, rather than hold back and arrive back in waving a piece of paper, as Neville Chamberlain did, peace in our time, and a year later you're at war. Well, at least he bought them some time to build more Spitfires, I suppose.
But to this day, he's known as the Great Appeaser.
Yeah. What did Winston Churchill say? Appeasement is the art of making sure you're the one who's eaten last by the crocodile. Something like that. Yeah.
I love the way that man spoke.
Yeah, and America still maintains its carrier battle groups. Thank you very much. we really like them. But you maintain them, I presume. I'm not sort of thinking for the Americans here, but I'm presuming, okay, it's part of the deterrence policy. We have a big stick and walk quietly and have a big stick. Whoever said that, was it Mao Zedong or Roosevelt?
Roosevelt, the first one.
We lean on you guys. We have what we call the alliance, and where I sit now, just down the road in the harbour, we fought together, shoulder to shoulder, in World War II for the very first time. We fought together at the Battle of Hamel in World War I. World War II, it was Darwin. Right. And USS Peary went down fighting. The entire air defence of Darwin on the 19th of February 42, when the bad guys arrived, 188 Japanese aircraft was flown by 10 US Kitty Hawks. So hang on, where are the Aussies? They're in Britain fighting Germany. And we didn't have a lot of people in those days. It was a small nation. I think we had 6 million people. The country's huge. And we'd stripped our defences to go and fight in Europe from 1939 onwards. And then Pearl Harbor happens, and you guys start arriving here because you're trying to push north. And one US general said, Australia's a giant aircraft carrier. It just doesn't go anywhere, but it carries aircraft. And so it did. We had 208 enemy air missions over Northern Australia in World War II, and some of them were bomber raids of over 100 aircraft.
Which
They were to
most
go.
Americans do not know about.
Yeah, they gave us a good seeing to. But look, you guys saved our backsides in World War II, and we thank you for it. And we should be thanking you for it every year, and we do actually. On the 19th of February, the Americans have a strong presence here at the commemoration of that first air raid. The alliance is still well and strong today, and we do lean on you. We're a small nation, population-wise. We only got about 26 million people. We are sort of wealthy. We've got a lot of stuff we dig up and sell to people, and we sort of we think like you as much as we can. We have our own sort of culture, but we're pretty cognizant of the idea that the Americans are here, and President Obama was here 2011, I think it was. I was tasked with helping to write his speech because I was a history guy and I was in the armed forces, and they rang me up one day and said, "Guess what you're doing next week?" I offered to go to the White House to do it, but hey, they knocked me back. But anyway, he arrived, and he made a speech on the Esplanade here. I'm proud to say I wrote one of his jokes. But anyway, he went to Canberra and he went to various other places, and he arrived in Darwin. And at the Esplanade here, where the Peary guns mounted, a gun from one of the destroyer that was sunk in the harbour here with the loss of 88 of your lives, it points to the spot where the wreck of the Peary lies. And he said, "We are a Pacific nation and we are here to stay." And I said, "Oh, thank God for that." Because we rely on you. It's pretty lonely down here at the bottom of the world.
Well, we do love you guys. So one thing, and getting back to the book, because I could talk to you about this stuff forever, but I definitely want folks to pick up this book. What I liked about the book is your travels to Japan and to get the Japanese voice and extremely research. For you as the author, what was the hardest part of the book as far as research that you had to do?
I think getting my head around what that invasion would have looked like. I understand as much as I can, and when I first went to war in 2006, you think because you've had a few military history books published and you're sort of an intelligence guy that you understand war, and you very quickly sort of realise that, hey, there's a lot more to understand that you didn't know how wars work. It's sort of the surreal landscape in which you're now surrounded. I sort of thought I knew World War II in Europe pretty well. I thought I knew concepts of warfare pretty well. But the way the Japanese would have fought, you can't replace that unless you go there and drive around. You go down to Kyushu, you sort of work out, what do they call it, walking the ground of the battlefield. And this is walking the ground of a potential battlefield. So you go to Waterloo, you sort of say, "Oh, okay, I see why the Brits did that, because the French were coming up here and that hill's there," and so on. So you go to Japan, you drive around the Kyushu Peninsula, you stop your car by the side of the road and you get out, and there's a photograph in the book of where I did that. I got out at one particular spot and took a photograph of the side of the hill. It's like Omaha Beach. It's like, oh, now I see why this would have not been a holiday. This would not have been fun. This would have been worse than Normandy, because it doesn't have that flat ground behind Omaha Beach. I mean, where the Allies landed in Normandy, some of the beaches, they've gunned the defences so well, they walked ashore and there wasn't much in the way of opposition.
So
Omaha Beach didn't go too well.
I don't know if you're familiar with a war game company that does PC games called John Tiller Simulations.
No.
He has one game, Japan 45, Japan 46, that is operational level view of the invasion of Japan, both the Kyushu and Hokkaido. And it is the hardest game to play because it is unlike every other game, and I'll send you a link to it. It is one of the more interesting games to play because it shows you how hard it would be to prosecute a war against that type of enemy in that type of terrain, because a lot of your capabilities are not effective. The maneuver warfare until you got to the Tokyo plain just did not exist.
You just would find that your spearhead was so negated, it was so blunted, And every time you slow down, it's an opportunity for somebody to wheel out an artillery piece from a cave, take a couple of shots at you and get it back inside again before you can do the same to it. And the Japanese did that so well in places like Okinawa. I was amazed when I went to Okinawa at the extent of the tunnelling there that they'd done. And the way the Japanese lived on a handful of rice a day. They're just so resolute. It breaks the heart of most soldiers. But the Japanese, it just goes, they had little slogans. If your heart's on the ground, if you're feeling sad, you're just not fighting hard enough. Now get back in there, do the right thing for the emperor. You sort of think, okay, maybe that's a propaganda thing. No, yeah, they really thought like that. They really existed like that. They're crazy. I love them, but my cousin's lived there since 1975. He's British, and he speaks like a native. But I sort of tap into him now and again. Does he really understand the Japanese? I think after 40 years or so, he's got a reasonable idea, but he's still sort of a bit Western in some of his approaches. It would have broken the hearts of our people as they inched their way up that peninsula. And there's an ironic thing. I mean, if we hadn't used the atomic weapons there, and the atomic weapons were being developed, and you're then getting to the stage where you've got nukes ready to go into the battlefield, you might have even done another test run somewhere, and then you say, okay, look, this isn't going too well. Why don't we just nuke a few of these places ahead of us, and that will really wreck their day in terms of supplying their own people and so on. And while we're doing it, why don't we just drive our own people through that nuclear blast area, because we don't understand nuclear weapons yet. We don't understand how it would affect our own people.
It was healthy for you back then, right?
So yeah, it would have been worse if we hadn't used those nuclear weapons. We'd have probably used them in 1946, and we wouldn't have used 2, we'd have used 6. The war would have been so awful that as we inched our way towards Tokyo, everybody, look, is there anything we can do to short circuit this, to end it? I feel really sorry for those people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I've been to both places. I've been to museums. I thoroughly disagree with the Nagasaki Museum and its sort of attitude about nuclear weapons. But you look at the photographs, it's impossible not to be moved. We've all got families. They're human beings just like us. But at the end of the day, the title of the book was Atomic Salvation. And I stuck with that title for a long time. I mean, titles are a hard thing to come up with. You're always looking for something good for a book, and you and your publisher ruminate about things for months, and then you come up with something, and a year later you think that didn't work very well. But Atomic Salvation, I thought, that's a bit daring. But at the end of it, I think the last sentence of the book is that's why it's called Atomic Salvation.
It is your last sentence, and that is why this book is called Atomic Salvation. But you made that point well before you get to that.
Yeah, but lucky Japanese, lucky Japan, lucky us that the war ended like this. It would have looked so different. And for people who trot that line out every August, I just really sort of, I suppose the book's heavy enough, grab it and bash them on the head with it. Don't you understand? Do some research before you come up with facile slogans like this that you want to sort of trot out to advance your political causes, whatever they are. Do some research and look at that chapter where everybody I interviewed and every World War II veteran I got hold of once I started researching the book, I gave them a quick 2-question interview. And the last question was, how do you feel about the use of the atomic weapons? And every one of them said, bloody good idea, or words to that effect. And some of them were a little bit vengeful, and so they would be, seeing their mates die. But a lot of it was, thank God for that. I now realise I was going to live. My son will see his father again.
You have a whole chapter on that in the book.
Yeah.
So one of the things, you talk about the museum, and you look at the period, I would say that we still live in the kind of bipolar atomic period or nuclear period. Do you think a lot of the pushback or the negative press the bombings got was nuclear fear the world was in 3 to 4 decades after the atomic bombs were dropped?
Yeah, I don't understand that either. I think I've made a few references at the end of it. As I said before, I teach the Cold War and I teach World War II, and sort of that link as to what was happening in Europe after that. I was in Berlin last year, back when we were allowed to travel and so on. And you're sort of looking at that big wall that's 60 kilometres or whatever it's left. It runs down the middle. And they're sort of saying it's real evidence of the fact that nobody wanted to really sort of, well, there are plenty of party advocates, I suppose, but all the traffic over that wall was one way. You didn't find anybody trying to get in, trying to get out.
Right.
So I'm not under any illusion about what would the Soviets' attitude been if atomic weapons hadn't been around. I reckon you'd have seen them slowly inching their way towards the UK and France. UK was nervous enough to develop its own deterrent in the 1950s-60s. They got American reactors for their submarines and built their own nuclear submarines very quickly with American help, and they put Polaris missiles on board. They had Vulcan bombers that were capable of reaching Russian airspace, and so on. Nuclear weapons are a great thing. That's another terrible thing I've said. But look, I think realistically, they kept the world safe. You'd have had World War III. And look at the firepower that was able to be summoned in 1945. And look at the firepower of conventional warfare in Vietnam.
Right.
Nuclear weapons are that big thing that sort of, look, you better not go too far, because if you do, that's going to happen. You want to invade that country, we're definitely going to use battlefield nukes, and you know where that leads. So if I was a Soviet commissar, and I was a Soviet leader and thinking about this, how am I going to sort of invade the West? Well, I guess I'm not going to do it that way. Nobody wants a nuclear war. So
right.
Look, they're a good idea. I love them.
Yeah.
I really do want. I want Australia to have its own nuclear deterrence. I'm allowed to say that now because I'm out of the armed forces.
Well, because I'm out of the armed forces, one thing, I have a background in nukes, and I've been within spitting distance of a nuclear warhead. And there's something about it that gives you a chill and a sweat down your back, because these are not very large, and it looks like you can almost take it and run with it. That you look at this and you say, this can kill 200,000 people in less than a second, the way nuclear weapons work. There's a fear, even the operators have of it, that when you see it, it gives you this. I could just tell you my recollection. The time I saw it, I had a little shiver and a little sweat, just because of the awesomeness, the firepower of something so small. To me,
it really, it brings it home to you. E equals M, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly
energy
does.
equals mass equals energy. Yeah, I sort of, when I've sort of had to explain it occasionally in classes, I've said, look, let's get a match. And I get a match, light the match, and we all look at the match and they go, what's this lunatic talking about? Look, mass is just equal to energy. We made that thing, that wooden thing there with that stuff on the end, phosphorus or whatever it is. We made it explode, and you got light, and you got heat, and you got sound. And we all go, yeah, it's pretty impressive. All right, nuclear weapons are just an advancement of that. It's like if you imagine gunpowder. Let's put a couple of ounces of gunpowder on the end of that big barbecue match and give it a go. Let's not do that, sir. Why don't we not do that today? Says one of the students maybe. But nuclear weapons, they're sort of, it shows you how smart mankind is. Those people in the Manhattan Project, talk about respect, very clever people.
Right.
So that's it's unfashionable to say that, nuclear weapons, but I'm going to keep saying it.
I am sure that you read the very large Richard Rhodes book on making the atomic bomb. Yeah, it's scary, and that is, perhaps why we haven't been able to use that in the last 70 years. I mean, I'm thankful personally that because there's no way to contain that. It's going to be a bad day for the entire Earth, but maybe it's kept us from having a bloodletting.
Yeah, I used that film the day after.
Go watch Threads. Go watch Threads.
Yeah, I have.
BBC.
I have. It's depressing, isn't it? I sort of I like to use The Day After because was it filmed in? It was filmed in Kansas, wasn't it?
Yeah, Missouri.
You
Yeah.
had that image of the people standing there and they're watching their ICBMs lifting away, the Minuteman missiles lifting away out of the silos, and a couple of them sort of saying, "That means either theirs are launching right now or theirs just launched 25 minutes ago. Either way, they're on the way."
Yeah,
And you
that's
think
there.
this is the end. This is the end, guys. No wonder they called it The Day After. It wasn't the day it happened. If you survived through it, the day after was even worse. You realise that this is the end. So yeah,
Yeah,
but look at Europe after the Soviets had marched across it. Nobody wanted to be invaded by the Soviets, and you're sort of looking at the devastation of Europe after World War II and what modern firepower could do to a village or a town or a city. And you're thinking, okay, that could have been very well World War III. In the 1950s, I think the Soviets were mad enough to do that sort of stuff if nukes hadn't been around.
right. Yeah, Berlin.
Yeah.
Actually, getting ready for this interview, I rewatched the movie 13 Days about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, yes, I use that too. It's great, isn't it?
It is, and because it brings up that fear that I think today, my son's 14, he'll never understand or know that. And I remember speaking to people that were there for the exercise that we had, Able Archer in Germany in '83, and how
Mm.
frightened they were. Like, oh my God, this can happen. Because it becomes unthinkable. So one thing I was going to ask from reading the book, if you could go back in time and be an advisor to either to Truman or to the Japanese, and I wouldn't say the emperor as much as the Privy Council, who made the ultimate decision to finally capitulate, what advice would
Mm.
you have given them based on the research from the book?
Oh, Truman, I would have said, look, sir, never underestimate these people. They're crazy brave. They will fight you to the end. They just don't think like us. They don't think like the Germans. They don't capture our prisoners like the Germans. You get captured by the Germans, you're going to live. You're captured by these guys, 35% of them, the prisoners die. This is war like there's no understanding of war before. The US Civil War, that was horrible. That was terrible. I mean, you lost nearly 1 million dead. This is all over again, sir. It's going to keep happening. We need to short circuit this right now. And if I had the ear of anybody in Japan, well, Kay's, I think I quote quite a bit in the book. One of the ambassadors, he wrote a great book about the end of the war. He sort of knew the cabinet personally, the emperor, and so on. I'd have been trying to get the ear of the emperor, but look, to be honest, I'd have been trying to get in there with a small pistol and kill the people in the cabinet who kept opposing it. I mean, what was one? Was it Enemy? The
Enemy.
Minister for the Navy. Yeah, Minister for the Navy. Was he? I think he was the guy who kept saying, "We got 100 million Japanese ready to die." They had 71 million in the population, but it sounded really good when you said it. We got 100 million ready to die. And was he also the one that was sort of? There were a couple of them that were saying, "Bring it on." If we get them to come and fight us in the home islands, the mainland of Japan, we're going to hand them such a thrashing that their hearts will be on the ground, to use that American Indian expression. And which he didn't use, of course. But they would have handed us such a bad time that we would have been so depressed that we'd have gone, what's that? What the Japanese want? Wasn't it? Conditional surrender. I guess we can do that. It's just one syllable. Unconditional, conditional. And
it was a conditional surrender, though.
Yeah. Their reasoning was, we can get what we want. We'll have our own war crimes trials. They'll be about 5 minutes, and we'll do them next Thursday afternoon.
Right.
We'll just continue on. We'll continue to hold on to power. And the mad Bushido attitude of, we'll run this place and we'll run it like we like, militarism, as some people have called it. When I was first in Japan, my cousin's wife is Japanese. She took me to the family cemetery, and I'm sure she thought it was a great outing. I was sort of a bit confused. Where are we going? The way that you go in there and you get a bucket and a sponge and a brush and so on, you go and wash the gravestones and pay your respects and so on. They go back to the 1300s in her family.
Hmm.
And they were Bushido, and these ran the place really, really nicely. Everybody was a peasant except for you, and up the top there was the royal family, and it was a mad feudal society. So, yeah, my sort of advice would have been to get these people out, but it would have also been, look, there's only one way out for these people, and it's death, and they're not going to change their mind. They didn't. It took the emperor to change their mind. Even then, there's a chapter in the book early on which talks about the resolution of the Japanese. They had a rebellion after the atomic weapons. So
Right.
the atomic weapons are being dropped. They go, oh well, I guess we have a revolution here. Now the emperor's never wrong. He's
And,
divine.
and you
He's
read
just
the
been
book,
misguided.
and you read the book Japan's Longest Night. I'm sure, obviously,
Yes,
because you
yeah.
put it in the book, which to me really kind of opens up this duality of Japanese thinking. Of
Mm.
they had this mindset that they really could continue the war and impose such a cost that they really would have, like you said, crimes will be next Thursday, will be over by Friday morning. Um, eh,
Yeah, they're
and
one
anime,
step ahead.
right?
Yeah, one step ahead of Suzuki. I mean, Suzuki, the prime minister, is trying to kill him, and he's just getting out of the house, and the bad guy's coming in the front door. He's going out the back, and literally, and they sort of at one stage, I think, had a car breakdown or something like that, and then they
That could have
had
been a
to
near
hide.
run thing.
Yeah, then they hid the records that the emperor's speech was on behind something or other, and the people who came in to ransack the place didn't find them, because if they had broken them, of course, those recordings wouldn't have gone out. The first time a lot of people heard their emperor's voice, and that was being broadcast immediately the next morning. Things haven't gone too well, fellas. I guess we're going to do it things this way. Everybody start doing things this way as of now. And those records would have been broken into small pieces of shellac, LP 78s, weren't they? And that would have been the end of that idea.
Yeah.
But there's even things in the book where there's people determined to take off, and they're going to take off and do kamikaze raids on the gathering Allied fleet, even up towards the days when you're starting to think about getting the signing ceremony together on the decks of Missouri and so on. And people sort of arguing the emperor's been misled. The emperor's not wrong. The emperor just hasn't received the right information. Let's get him the right information, and let's keep attacking.
Well, with one 2,000-word speech, he changed Japanese forever. He ended the Bushido system. You could
Yeah,
imagine the shock um, that the Japanese felt, not only hearing his voice, but really kind of changing their culture forever. It's
yeah.
we don't have anything we can compare it to
No, it really
in
took
the
that. I
Western world.
think. Yeah, it really took that. There was one diary I read of some young bloke. I think he was 15 or something. By this time, he was out of school. He was making grenades in a little factory near Nagasaki, and he just reported to work the next day. And there was this big cloud in the distance, and sort of, big bang over there. But you're Japanese. What do? Well, you just go to work because your job's making grenades. I've got to make 100 grenades a day, or whatever he did, and off he went. I sort of only the Japanese do stuff like that. They're mad, but I love them.
Yeah. No, and that comes out in the book. And I don't know how much time you have left. I'm going to have you back on because we do have so much stuff to talk about. I would love to do a whole thing on the Cold War. But just my impressions of the book. What I liked about it is there were that I wouldn't say agree with, but it kind of went against things I've always thought. Um, but the way you lay it out, it does make a compelling case. And I think one of the problems I had reading it is, to me, I kind of parked my car in the same garage as you. I don't see a problem with it. And I look for more than just 32 million lives. I look for all the reasons why I think Truman made the right decision. What I found most interesting about the book, and you stated it at the beginning of the interview, you quantified the cost in lives. When you say 32 million lives, I can't fathom 32 million of anything, and most people
No,
can't. I think
no.
that really you drive that home throughout the book, and you look at, well, what would have happened to the Allies and Japan had that battle been fought? I think that it gives a good case. But on the other side,
Mm,
not a criticism. I feel that the
mm,
people, and I don't know, I've never really run across anybody that says it was totally bad. Maybe
mm.
I've lived a different life. I don't know if even a 32 million factor of people dying would change their minds. I think that there's a lot. I think it's a very complex way of thinking. The folks that look at it
Mm.
as terrorism. Look, we go to war, people die. Not all the people are bad. Even the combatants, not all of them are bad people. But people die, and that is the way we prosecute war. It's ugly.
Yeah, yeah,
History tries to clean it up a little bit, but the bottom
yeah.
line is these things happen.
I'd sort of have a bit more respect for some of these people if, and I haven't met too many of them either. It's sort of quite often it's some journalist or whatever making a facile comment, or somebody writes a letter to the editor or whatever. But I do make a point in the book several times, I think, and I make it in Lethality in Combat. Okay, you can make that comment from the safety of your lounge room 3 decades after, but I bet you weren't making that comment in the middle of 1944 when your
Correct.
grandfather was fighting for his life. I bet you weren't making that comment in 1945 in the middle of it when we finished Germany and then we had to turn our faces to Japan. Sort of, oh, let's not do this. Let's sort of have a bit of a pause here and ask the Japanese if they'd like to have a hug. No, it would have been on. There's
Right.
not too many of them around, and these days, with the resources we have to go back and look at the exact copies of newspapers at the time, you don't find too many people writing to the editor in the London Times and saying, "Oh, that bomber Harris guy, the bloke who put the Lancaster raids together over Germany, let's prosecute him because he's a war criminal." No, you don't. You don't find them. They're sort of too busy digging a vegetable patch because they're age 10 at the time, or trying to keep the house together because the husband's off fighting for the war, or grieving because their grandfather or their dad got dead in a bombing raid or something. My father's house was blown out from underneath him, literally. It was hit by a V2 missile.
Mhm.
Um, Later in the war. They were upstairs. His job was to make cups of tea, being British. They're in London. He had to make tea on Sunday morning and bring up the tea on trays with the newspapers. He'd just done that, and the missile hit the house. And the whole top of the house fell down inside the bottom of the house. And they all lived. And sort of, right, okay, try going through that. And then sort of saying, let's prosecute a few of our people for war crimes. Come off the grass, as we say over here.
Yeah. Yeah. It's going back in a time machine back to 45. I don't think it was an issue. Um, and like neither of us have met too many people with an alternate view, but I look at it as being a very complex view where war is complex in operation, but in mindset, it's very simple. It's very barbaric. It takes us
Isn't
back
it
to
just?
our human nature to survive. But
Yeah,
I really recommend. Okay, I'm sorry.
well, I was going to say the Enola Gay controversy in the 1990s. I can see why they were so angry. The Enola Gay going to go on display, and it's sort of being a bit ambivalent about the war. No, sorry, that's not what it was about. And I think it's sanctimonious and hypocritical, even from the safety of your armchair 3 or 4 decades afterwards. Oh well, things could have been done a little more differently and a little bit more nicely. Get away! It's just no. I'm sorry, it doesn't work for me. I don't respect that sort of attitude either. I think they're being hypocritical.
Well, I've seen both Boxcar and Enola Gay up close, and don't really have a problem with it. Other than the fact that I would love to have flown in the B-29, and I
Yeah,
think
me
there's
too.
one
Yeah,
left. There's
yeah, yeah. Yeah, respect for those people who build it. What an aircraft!
yeah. Um, it's just a very it's a very interesting question your book tackles, and it took me through a lot of introspective thinking, and that's really why I kind of want to look at the movie 13 Days again, and
Mm,
the story I said about seeing a real nuke and its effect. almost queasy for its fear. And if you look at it, it looks harmless, but it's not. And I think
No.
your book really quantifies something that no other author had before. And I've read most of the books you used as background material because I find it so fascinating. But I definitely want to recommend the book for folks out there
Many
that are
thanks.
interested in this topic.
Many
Um,
thanks, and thanks for what your country did in the war for us, and
well,
for mankind, and for the
we love you.
Japanese. Yeah.
We love your ally. As soon as I hit stop on the record, I want to tell you a story before you go. But I think it's a really good book. Um, what else is in the typewriter right now? Since you and I are of the same age,
Oh,
that's going to be coming
well,
out.
yeah, I'm doing we just had a bloke receive the Victoria Cross here, which is the equivalent of the Medal of Honor from the
Yeah.
Navy for the first time, and I wrote his biography about 5 years ago. So that's
Who
coming
was
out
it?
as a sort of re-edition. A bloke called Teddy Sheehan, who was killed on board HMAS Armidale against Japanese air attack north of Darwin
Oh,
in
okay.
into 42. So that's coming out as a sort of re-edition, but I'm doing one on US fighters over Darwin. 1942, they flew the entire air defence, as I said before. It's a small book for one of my publishers, but I do have a publisher in Britain, and I'm working on a book about the War of the Roses, medieval combat. And again,
Wow.
it's a bit like lethality in combat. It's arguing what battle really looked like, because there seems to be a bit of a sort of a gap there in that. How do these blokes with full face bassinets with the visor down? How did they work in battle? I mean, what do you do? Just get out there and start bashing people, and a couple of hours later, you sort of went off for a bit of a sit down. When you look at it in reality, and you're sort of working out, did they fight in lines, for example? Well, yes. Did they have one line or three or two? Well, I'm sort of arguing, and there's very bad source material here. I've used reenactors. I went to reenactor festivals and interviewed them and so on, and used logic, and I've got armour myself that we've sort of been testing. But it would seem that they had to replace that front line. You can't fight for much more than about 14 minutes or so with a poleaxe and your visor down in combat in War of the Roses without being replaced. You've got to be replaced. You just sort of collapse if you don't. So the front line had to be replaced, and the question is how. So the book sort of gets to grips with that and starts to examine some of the myths of medieval combat. There's a battle, for example, in Britain called Towton, where they sort of argue that 25,000 people died in one day in 1461.
Wow.
I'm going, no, they didn't, because they just couldn't. You couldn't kill that many, not with edged and club and missile weapons, not with that technology at that time, not with that armour. Plate armour was very good at protecting people, though not everybody was wearing plate on the battlefield. So again, it's the actuality of battle and sort of getting to grips with it, so to speak. So we've just been working on that. C19 has delayed things a bit, but that should be out next year as well. So it's
Well,
a
if you
busy,
write it,
busy year. Yeah.
if you write it, I'll read it.
No, thank you.
So, where can we find your book?
Well, they're all sort of on websites. I've got a couple of publishers over here, Big Sky Publishing, and Avonmore Books, and Casemate overseas are distributing for Big Sky, and Casemate's the publisher for next year.
If you could send me the links, I have Casemate. I will put it
Sure.
on this podcast,
Okay.
and hopefully it will be out next Tuesday. And I'll definitely send you a link. Tom, let me tell you what a pleasure it was. I am going to get a lot of stating that you're a plant,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like, we try to keep podcasts under. We said an hour, almost an hour and a half, because nobody wants to listen to me blather for that long. But I so want to thank you and the folks from Casemate for starting this, and hopefully we will be able to speak to you again in the future, because there's a lot of stuff I would love to talk to you about. And thank you very much, and I will turn it back to Sean in the studio.
Thanks so much for joining the show tonight. Remember to follow us on Twitter at No Dice, No Glory, and keep the conversation going on NoDiceNoGlory.com, now featuring our own message boards. Have a great night, everybody.